Some say the past stays buried in the Louisiana mud. They say the bayou waters swallow secrets whole. But sometimes the truth does not stay quiet. Sometimes it rises. And when it rises, it comes back hungry. Now let us begin. Part 1. The Purchase. Along the slow-moving waters of Bayou Teche, there once stood a plantation that no one speaks of today. The locals call it Belle Ombre, the beautiful shadow. But beauty was the last thing that lived there. This story is not written in history books. It survived only in whispers. And in the night cries heard in the cane fields when the moon is full. The truth begins in St. Landry Parish in the year 1853. Sugar had made the land rich. Rich enough to hide crimes. Rich enough to bury the dead without questions. Opelousas was the center of all this. It was a place where fine houses sat beside slave quarters. A place where church bells rang while blood dried in the fields. Wealth was built by hands that never rested. And behind that wealth was a name people spoke only when they had to. Patience Devereux. Patience Devereux was born into land and power. His family had crossed the ocean from France and carved their fortune from Louisiana soil. By 42 he owned more than 300 acres of sugarcane. He owned a mill. He owned every soul who lived and worked on Belle Ombre. 73 people, 73 lives that belonged to him in the eyes of the law. He was respected among planters. Feared among the enslaved. He spoke softly. He moved with control. And he punished in ways that could not be seen from the outside. His wife had died 7 years earlier. Some said sickness. Some said sorrow. Nobody asked. Nobody dared. Since then he lived alone in the grand white house with the tall columns and the wide veranda. A place that looked peaceful from far away. A place where quiet was not gentle but heavy and uneasy. In March of that year a slave trader came from Mobile. His name was Rufus Gaines. He led a chain of men and women marched like cattle. 22 souls. Some already hollow from grief. Some still fighting in their silence. Among them was a young girl. The record said she was 14. Nobody really knew. She might have been younger. She might have been older. She had already learned the price of being noticed. So she kept her eyes low and her face calm. Her name on the trader's paper was Clara. But names can be taken. Names can be stolen. Clara had already lost 5 names before this one. Devereux paid $800 for her. More than the others. More than any field hand cost. Men noticed. But they did not speak. Devereux always had his reasons. Clara was taken to Belle Ombre. There she began work in the kitchen under an elder woman named Aunt Rachel. Aunt Rachel had been on the plantation longer than any living soul. Her voice was quiet. Her eyes said what her words could not. Danger lived in this house. It breathed in the walls. It moved in the halls after dark. Clara woke before dawn. She cooked. She cleaned. She hauled water. The work was hard but familiar. Yet something about Belle Ombre was different. Something in the air. The other servants did not laugh. They did not whisper stories. They watched the doors. They listened for footsteps. They did not look one another in the eyes. One evening, while the sky glowed orange and frogs sang by the riverbank, Aunt Rachel spoke as they scrubbed the iron pots. She spoke without looking at Clara. "Child, keep your head down here. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not smile too much. Do not look too long. And if he calls for you, pray he forgets your name." Clara heard the warning, but she did not understand it yet. The understanding came late one night. The house was quiet. The cicadas outside buzzed like 1,000 needles. The lamps in the hallway were dim. A servant came to the kitchen and said the words no one ever wanted to hear. "Master wants the girl." Clara followed the servant through the silent corridors. Her heart beat softly but steady. She stepped into the study. The air smelled of smoke and ink. Books lined the shelves. Devereux sat behind his desk. His eyes were calm, too calm. He asked her a question. A question with no safe answer. "Can you read?" Reading was forbidden. Reading meant punishment. Reading meant danger. But he already knew. He had seen her eyes move across a page. He had watched her. She tried to deny it. But the denial did not matter. He smiled, not with kindness, but with certainty. From that night on Clara became something else. She became the object of his attention. The subject of his lessons. He made her read scripture to him. He made her copy passages over and over. When she made mistakes he corrected her. His corrections were slow, methodical. He hurt her in ways that left no marks but felt like fire beneath the skin. He called it instruction. She began to understand the fear in the house. Then one evening she saw his journal. He had left it open on the desk. She did not mean to look. But her eyes moved before she could stop them. Inside the pages were notes. Observations. Descriptions. Subject 7. Subject 9. Subject 12. Each one was a girl before her. Each one had been tested. Trained. Broken. The last entry before hers ended with 4 words. Required disposal. Regrettable but necessary. Clara understood then. She was not Clara anymore. She was subject 13. And Belle Ombre was not a home. It was a trap. The kind that no one escaped. Not alive. End of part 1. When you are ready, say, continue with part 2, and I will create the next chapter. Part 2. Title. The Quiet Breaking. Hook. Some monsters do not show their teeth. Some wear tailored suits, speak with soft voices, and say grace before meals. The most dangerous evil is the kind that smiles while tightening the cage around you. And at Belle Ombre, the cage was nearly complete. Now the story continues. Part 2. The Summer of Disappearance. The summer of 1853 Saturday heavy over St. Landry Parish like a weight pressing down from the sky. The heat did not simply warm the skin. It settled into the bones. It filled the lungs. It made breathing feel like work. In the fields the enslaved workers moved between the cane rows like shadows, their bodies dark against the tall green stalks. Their work songs drifted across the morning mist. Songs of sorrow. Songs of endurance. Songs that carried memories they were not allowed to speak aloud. On the surface everything at Belle Ombre looked as it always had. The bells rang to mark the hours. The cane grew. The overseers shouted orders across the fields. Neighboring planters came by to talk business and drink chilled lemonade on the veranda. They saw polished silver. They saw clean floors. They saw Patience Devereux standing tall and calm, his clothes perfect, his voice polite. They did not see the truth. Inside the big house the real work was happening. Not the work of sugar. The work of breaking a person without leaving scars that showed. Clara was disappearing. Not in body. Her hands still chopped vegetables. Her feet still entered rooms when summoned. Her voice still answered when spoken to. But inside her something was being taken piece by piece. Devereux was not a man ruled by sudden violence. He was patient. He believed in slow shaping. He used silence as a tool. He used sleep as a weapon. He used hunger like a scalpel. Some nights Clara was kept awake till dawn, forced to stand without moving, her knees trembling. Other nights she was allowed to sleep only to be woken suddenly to recite scripture. Sometimes she was fed nothing. Sometimes she was forced to eat large meals while he watched her with a studying gaze, asking questions that twisted shame like a blade. He wanted control not only of her body but of her mind. He wanted to erase the person and replace her with something empty. He was proud of this method. He believed it was art. He believed it was science. Clara felt herself fading. She felt memories blur. Sometimes her own name felt distant. She spoke less. She breathed quieter. She watched herself from far away like a person watching a reflection in still water. But while Devereux believed he was hollowing her out, something else was forming inside her. Something colder. Something sharper. Not hope. Hope was gone. Something like stone. Something like steel. Observation. Clara began to watch him the way he watched her. She noticed the way he hummed to himself when pleased. She noticed how he held his glass when drinking. She noticed that he always removed the key to his private rooms before sleeping. He placed it on the small table beside his bed. She counted the steps from the study to his bedroom. She memorized the floors that creaked. She watched the rhythm of the household. When servants moved. When the halls were empty. When the night was deepest. The other enslaved people knew what was happening. They had always known. They did not look at her for long. They feared their eyes might speak too much. But they tried in small ways to help. A piece of cornbread left under a folded cloth. A cup of water placed where she would find it. A quiet touch on her shoulder when no one watched. Aunt Rachel tried once to speak up. She went to the overseer, a man named Dalton. She told him softly that Clara was being worked too hard. That she should be reassigned. Dalton listened. He said nothing. Later that day he went straight to Devereux. Aunt Rachel was placed in the punishment shed behind the sugar mill. The shed had no windows. The walls were stained with history. She stayed there 3 days. When she emerged she did not speak of Clara again. The scars on her back told the rest. As summer faded and the air shifted toward autumn, Clara heard whispers. A name, a memory, a warning. There had been another girl before her. And another before that. And more before them. Girls purchased from far away. Girls isolated. Girls who disappeared. One had drowned in the bayou. That was the story. But no one believed she chose it. Clara felt the cold truth settle inside her. She was next. Then one evening she overheard Devereux speaking to Dalton in the hallway outside his study. His voice was calm, almost cheerful. Gaines will arrive on the 20th. Make sure the girl is cleaned and prepared. A buyer has been found. Dalton asked something too soft to hear. Devereux replied again. After that she becomes someone else's problem. Clara stood behind the open doorway holding her breath. She understood exactly what that meant. She had 12 days. 12 days before she would be sent to the sugar parishes farther south. Everyone knew what that meant. Those plantations were death. Not slow death. Quick death. Brutal death. No one returned. The thought did not bring fear. It brought clarity. She could not run. Patrols would catch her. She could not ask for help. The law would return her. So she did not dream of escape. She began to think of something else. Something darker. Something final. Something that did not end with her being the one who disappeared. On the night of October 10th the air was thick with the scent of cane ready for harvest. The moonlight rested on the sugar fields like pale water. Clara stood in the kitchen house while everyone slept. Her hands rested on the wooden table. Her heartbeat was steady. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She had made her choice. If she was going to be taken from this world, she would not go alone. End of part 2. When you are ready for part 3, say. Continue with part 3. Part 3. Title. The Night of Decision. Hook. Some choices are made in silence long before they are carried out. Sometimes a person reaches a point where fear ends and clarity begins. And on the plantation called Belle Ombre, Clara had reached that point. Now the story continues. Part 3. The planning. Clara knew she could not escape. People who tried to run rarely survived. The patrols were everywhere, armed and eager to catch runaways. The swamps swallowed those who did not know their paths. The rivers carried bodies that were never recovered. And the law saw her as a thing, not a person to protect. No one was coming to save her. But she could act. That night, Clara took account of everything she had. It was not much, yet it was enough. She knew the house. She knew Devereux. She had seen his worst behavior. She had endured it. She had learned things he never intended to teach her. How the body reacts to pain. Where a person is weak. Where a person is most vulnerable. Devereux had taught her these lessons. He believed he was shaping her into something obedient and broken. He did not understand that he was teaching her how to end him. Clara began to plan quietly and carefully. The plantation had many tools, but most would draw attention if she carried them. The sugar mill held blades sharp enough to slice cane. The workshops held axes and saws. The kitchen held knives. But Clara needed something she could hold without raising suspicion. She found it in Devereux's study. A letter opener. It was nearly a foot long and made from Sheffield steel. It was polished and elegant, a tool that looked harmless. It lay on his desk every day. Devereux used it to open correspondence from other planters, from traders, from politicians. Clara noticed how easily it sliced through thick paper. She noticed the sharpness of the point. In the right hands, it could be more than a letter opener. It could be a weapon. She also learned something else. Every Wednesday night, Devereux drank heavily as he reviewed the plantation accounts. He would sit at his desk with a bottle of bourbon. By the end of the evening, the bottle would be nearly empty. His voice would grow thick. His eyelids heavy. His steps uneven. Wednesday, October 14th, would be her chance. She repeated this to herself again and again. Wednesday, October 14th. The days moved slowly, each hour weighed down with fear and determination. Clara carried out her daily tasks as always. She washed dishes. She cleaned rooms. She prepared meals. She listened for changes in routine. She memorized the rhythm of the house late at night. She counted steps. She studied silence. There was fear inside her, but the fear did not control her. Beneath it was something harder and colder. She was no longer waiting for fate. She was shaping it. The plantation carried on around her. The cane fields rustled in the breeze. The sugar mill clanged with tools and repairs. The enslaved families gathered in small groups after dark, speaking softly, holding one another in little pockets of comfort and humanity. Clara watched it all with a strange stillness. It was as if she were already standing outside her own life, looking in. She noticed small things more than she ever had before. The way the sunlight caught in the spider webs on the porch columns. The smell of wood smoke drifting from the cabins. The sound of Aunt Rachel humming in the kitchen. These things felt like memories being stored for later. Memories for someone already preparing to leave the world behind. On Monday, October 12th, a traveling preacher visited Bel Ombre. He preached in the open space behind the quarters while the overseer watched. He read from Exodus, the story of Moses leading his people out of bondage. He spoke of deliverance. He spoke of faith. He spoke of waiting for God to act. Clara listened, but the words slid over her. She had prayed before. She had begged before. She had waited before. God had not intervened. She would not wait any longer. After the service, Aunt Rachel approached her quietly. The older woman spoke with care so no one listening would understand the meaning of her words. "Child, do not do what you are planning." Clara did not speak at first. But her silence spoke for her. Aunt Rachel continued, "I saw that look before. Long ago. On a boy who believed death was better than living like this. They caught him before he could act. He suffered. Then they sold him. He died soon after." Clara listened, but she did not change her mind. "My life is already gone," she said softly. "I am being sold on the 20th. To the sugar plantations near the southern coast. You know what that means." Aunt Rachel closed her eyes. The pain in her face was a story all its own. "Oh child, not there." Clara looked at her directly. "So you see, I am already dead. I only choose how." The older woman was silent. Then she nodded once. "If you are going to do this, you must finish it. Do not leave him alive. If you do, he will continue. And others will suffer." Clara nodded. "I understand." Aunt Rachel gave her hand a brief squeeze. "May the Lord have mercy on your soul, child. And none on his." Then she walked away, leaving Clara standing alone in the deepening dusk. Tuesday, October 13th arrived. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds that never released rain. Clara moved through her work for the day. She noticed every detail as if seeing the world for the final time. In the afternoon Devereux summoned her to his study. She walked up the stairs slowly and calmly. Past the portraits lining the wall. Faces of long-dead Devereux men staring down with expressions of confidence and entitlement. She knocked on the study door. "Enter," he said. Clara opened the door and stepped inside. The room was quiet. The bourbon decanter sat where it always sat. The letter opener lay across the papers on the desk. Devereux looked up at her with calm eyes. "Ah, Clara, close the door. Sit." She sat in the straight-backed chair across from him. Her heart was steady. Her mind was clear. Tomorrow was Wednesday. And on Wednesday, everything would change. End of part 3. When you are ready for part 4, say. Continue with part 4. Here's a modified and engaging version of part 4 of your historical horror story, written in a story style for an American YouTube audience. I kept it easy to understand, suspenseful, and cinematic, with a strong hook. Some choices cannot be undone. Some moments define life and death in ways that ordinary people cannot imagine. On the eve of her fate, Clara was no longer just a girl, she had become a force the Devereux plantation had never anticipated. Tonight, we step inside the walls of Bel Ombre to witness the moment when fear transforms into something far more dangerous. Part 4. The October night had arrived, heavy with humidity that pressed against the skin and made every breath feel like inhaling water. Clara moved through the quiet corridors of Belle Ombre with the precision of a shadow, every creak of the floorboards memorized, every step carefully measured. Her hand brushed against the cool wood of the banister, counting steps, calculating angles, memorizing every corner where she could hide if she needed to. She paused at the study door, listening. Inside, Devereux's voice hummed low as he reviewed ledgers, his speech slurred slightly by the bourbon he had consumed that evening. Clara had watched him closely for weeks, noting his vulnerabilities, studying how alcohol dulled his meticulous control, how it slowed his reactions. Tonight, that knowledge would be her weapon. The letter opener rested in her palm like an extension of her will, cold steel warming slightly against her skin. It was ordinary enough to draw no attention if she were caught carrying it, but tonight it carried the potential to end the reign of terror that had consumed her life. Every glance, every word, every forced act of submission had built toward this. She stepped into the room, the door barely making a sound, and approached the desk where Devereux sat, lost in his papers. He looked up briefly, noting her presence with his usual calm curiosity. "Ah, Clara, come in. Sit, we have much to review," he said, gesturing to the chair she had been made to occupy so many times before. She sat, but her movements were different now, deliberate, steady. Fear had transformed into a focused intensity, a clarity born of necessity. She set the letter opener on the desk, a casual placement, her hand brushing the edge. Devereux's eyes flicked to it briefly, but he dismissed it, absorbed in his numbers. "You've improved in your copywork," he said, not looking up. "Your penmanship is precise. You learn quickly, Clara." She nodded, letting the words wash over her. It was an acknowledgement she did not need. She had learned far more than writing. She had learned observation, patience, anatomy, human weakness. She had absorbed his methods, memorized his routines, calculated his patterns. And tonight, that knowledge would shift the balance. As Devereux continued speaking, Clara leaned slightly, pretending to reach for a ledger. Her fingers curled around the handle of the letter opener. She could feel the weight of it, the sharp edge, the pointed tip. Her heart beat steadily, controlled, the rhythm of preparation rather than panic. Devereux continued, unaware that the person he had spent months breaking was no longer the same girl. He spoke of sugar yields, of deliveries to New Orleans, of minor inconveniences among his workers. Every word, every distraction, was a thread in the tapestry of his downfall, and Clara wove herself carefully into the pattern. Suddenly, a loud thump from upstairs, just enough to startle him, made Devereux glance toward the ceiling. That split second of distraction was all she needed. She moved, swift and silent, and thrust the letter opener with precision she had never allowed herself to imagine. The blade struck with controlled force, aiming for a place she had memorized from weeks of observation, a point where he could not react fast enough. Devereux's eyes widened in shock. His body tensed, then crumpled forward, spilling papers across the desk. The room smelled of copper and fear. Clara froze for a heartbeat, then acted again, ensuring that the threat he posed would end with him. She did not falter. Silence followed, thick and heavy. The only sound was her own breathing and the faint rustle of papers disturbed in the struggle. She leaned back, feeling the gravity of what she had done settle around her. There was no triumphant release, only the cold, meticulous satisfaction of survival and justice. Outside, the plantation continued its nocturnal rhythm. Cicadas hummed in the darkness. The sugar mill, the fields, the quarters, all unaware that the master who had ruled them with cruelty would never rise again. Clara's hands shook slightly, but her resolve did not waver. The fear that had once paralyzed her had been transformed into an unrelenting determination to act, to survive, to reclaim her life. Her mind worked quickly. She knew that discovery was inevitable. Steps would echo through the hallways soon, voices would call her name, questions would follow. She had to move, to plan her next steps, to ensure that Devereux's dark designs could harm no one else. Clara collected what she needed: keys, papers, small tokens of proof of Devereux's dealings. Every detail might serve her later, whether to secure safety or to reveal the atrocities she had endured. She moved with silent efficiency, her body and mind functioning as one. The house that had once been a place of confinement was now a field of opportunity, every corridor and shadow her ally. As she descended the staircase, careful to avoid creaking boards, Clara felt something shift within her. Fear remained, yes, but it was no longer the driving force. It was calculation, focus, resolve. Every lesson Devereux had taught her, pain, endurance, observation, had become tools she wielded against him. Outside, the October night pressed close, the humidity clinging to her like a second skin. The fields stretched into darkness, hiding possibilities and threats alike. She knew escape was not immediate. She would have to navigate patrols, guards, and the eyes of those loyal to the Devereux name. But she was no longer the helpless girl who had arrived in March. She was deliberate, precise, capable. She had survived long enough to strike back, and the reckoning had begun. As she slipped into the shadows of the plantation yard, the first inkling of dawn in the eastern sky hinted at the end of one life and the emergence of another. Clara had crossed the threshold from victim to agent, from prey to predator. And what came next would be unlike anything Street, Landry Parish, or anyone in the sugarcane fields, had ever witnessed. If you want, I can continue with part 5 in the same gripping, cinematic style, keeping it 1,000 words for YouTube, building the suspense toward Clara's escape and the consequences of her actions. Do you want me to do that next? Here's a modified, gripping version of part 5 of your historical horror story for an American YouTube audience, keeping it around 1,000 words, easy to understand, and cinematic. Hook. Some nights change everything. Some decisions echo through history long after the sun rises. Tonight, we follow Clara as the shadows of Belle Ombre Plantation stretch around her, and a girl who once had no power becomes the architect of terror and justice. Part 5. The first gray light of morning crept across the sugarcane fields, painting the tall stalks with pale gold. Clara moved with the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed every step countless times. She had studied the patterns of the guards, the patrols, the overseer Dalton's morning rounds, and now she used that knowledge like a map to guide her through danger. Her hands still trembled slightly from the night before, from the weight of what she had done, but the cold flame of determination burned steadily inside her. Devereux was dead, his reign of cruelty ended, yet she knew the plantation itself would not forgive her actions. Any misstep, any sound, any hint of suspicion could bring a flood of violence upon her. Clara moved toward the back of the plantation, skirting the edge of the field where the tall cane hid her from view. The dew soaked her shoes, and the humidity clung to her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was focused entirely on survival, on finishing what she had started. She had one goal: to escape before the world discovered what had happened in the study the night before. In the distance, she heard the faint creak of wagon wheels and the voices of laborers beginning their day. Their rhythm was comforting, a reminder that life continued despite the horrors within the big house. She had been invisible for months, blending into the background, performing the work expected of her without question. That invisibility was now her greatest weapon. She reached the edge of the sugar mill, where sharp tools and heavy machinery loomed in the shadows. Clara paused, scanning for any sign of the overseer or the men who might notice her absence. Dalton was not in sight, likely supervising the early harvest. She slipped past the mill, careful to avoid loose boards that could betray her presence. Her plan had been simple in theory but terrifying in execution. She needed to reach the river behind the plantation, a winding body of water that offered a path toward freedom if she could navigate it. Beyond that, the road to New Orleans was treacherous but possible. She had memorized the path from overheard conversations, from stolen moments listening to traders and drivers. Every detail mattered. A bend in the river, a fallen tree, a marshy section of land that could trap the unwary. As she moved, Clara reflected on what she had learned from Devereux. The cruel lessons, the methodical torments, the observations of human weakness, they had all become tools for her now. Pain had taught her endurance, fear had taught her precision, and isolation had sharpened her focus. What Devereux had intended as her destruction had instead become her preparation. Clara reached the river just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, the water glittering with the reflection of the morning sky. She paused, listening for sounds behind her, the clatter of boots or the bark of a dog. There was nothing, only the gentle rush of water and the distant cries of birds. She took a deep breath and began wading into the river, the cold water a shock against her skin, but invigorating. Each step carried her farther from the plantation and closer to the possibility of life beyond it. Her mind raced, cataloging everything she would need, where to hide, what supplies she had, the safest routes through the marshes, and the inevitable obstacles she would face. Hours passed as she moved along the riverbank, avoiding roads and settlements. Her legs ached, her feet were raw from the rough terrain, but she did not stop. Every sound in the surrounding swamp became a signal to her. The rustle of reeds, the splash of fish, the low growl of a distant animal, all were warnings, all required her attention. She had learned to read the world in subtle cues, a skill honed under Devereux's watchful eye. By midday, she had found a small cove along the river, hidden by overhanging trees and thick underbrush. Here she paused, allowing herself a brief moment to rest. She ate a small portion of cornbread she had hidden in her pocket, savoring it with the consciousness that this simple act of sustenance was now a statement of autonomy. Her thoughts turned to those she had left behind. Aunt Rachel, whose quiet support had given her courage. The other enslaved workers, who remained trapped under the same oppressive system. She wished she could warn them, help them, but the reality was stark. She could only survive herself. Each day in freedom might give her the strength to find a way back or to help others, but for now, the focus was survival. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Clara continued her journey along the river. She encountered obstacles. Fallen logs, deep mud, patches of quicksand hidden beneath leaves. Each challenge tested her physical strength and her resolve, but she met them with the patience and calculation that Devereux had instilled in her under the guise of teaching obedience. In the distance, the faint sound of a boat bell alerted her to the presence of human activity. Traders or hunters, perhaps, moving along the waterway. She crouched low, using reeds and trees to conceal herself, holding her breath until the sound faded. Each narrow escape strengthened her resolve. Failure was not an option, the alternative was death, either at the hands of men who saw her as property or through the brutal plantations south of New Orleans. Nightfall approached, bringing with it a thick fog that rolled across the river. Clara welcomed it, the mist hiding her from potential eyes, wrapping her in a cloak of anonymity. She had traveled farther than she ever imagined she could, relying on every skill she had learned, every observation she had made. And yet, the path ahead remained uncertain, filled with dangers she could not fully predict. Finally, as darkness fully claimed the river, Clara found herself at a small clearing where the water slowed, forming a natural dock. She paused, listening for signs of life, then took the bold step of venturing further. The journey was far from over, but she had crossed the first threshold. She had moved from victim to actor, from prisoner to someone taking control of her destiny. Clara rested briefly, allowing the night sounds of the swamp to fill her senses. Somewhere in the distance, the cries of the plantation's animals and the faint hum of human voices reminded her of what she had left behind. The Devereux name still held power, but tonight, in the shadows of the Louisiana swamp, Clara held her own. Tomorrow, the journey would continue. The river would lead her south, toward freedom or danger, toward life or death. But she was ready. The fear that had once dominated her every thought had been transformed into precision, determination, and an unbreakable will. And so, under the cold watch of the Louisiana night, Clara stepped forward into the darkness, leaving behind the terror of Belle Ombre and stepping into a fate of her own making. If you want, I can continue with part 6, building the tension toward the climax of Clara's journey and the repercussions for the plantation, keeping the story cinematic and gripping for YouTube. Do you want me to do that next? Here's a fully reworked, gripping part 6 of your historical horror story, around 1,000 words, easy for American YouTube audiences, cinematic, with an engaging hook. Some escapes are more than survival, they are the birth of vengeance. Tonight, we follow Clara as she confronts the shadows of her past and faces the final, terrifying legacy of Belle Ombre Plantation. What happens when the hunted becomes the hunter? Part 6. The fog hung thick over the Louisiana swamps, swallowing the edges of the river and the faint shapes of cypress trees. Clara moved carefully, her bare feet sinking into the damp soil, each step measured, silent. She had traveled farther than she ever thought possible, yet she knew the plantation's reach was long. News traveled fast, and there were hunters who would track a runaway girl without hesitation. Her mind raced with the knowledge she had accumulated over months of observation. She had learned the habits of the men who worked Belle Ombre, the routines of those who enforced Devereux's cruel will. She knew how the overseer Dalton would react if he discovered her absence, how swiftly the gossip would spread to other plantations, and how the law treated people like her, as property, not human beings. But Clara no longer thought like the powerless. She thought like someone who had endured the impossible and survived. She thought like someone who had learned to turn fear into strategy. Tonight, she was no longer just escaping. She was striking back. For weeks, she had been planning what she could not undo by running alone. Devereux's death had been the spark, but the plantation itself still held horrors that she could not ignore. The journals she had found in his study, the detailed accounts of torture and manipulation, the list of those who had disappeared, those lives demanded something beyond silence. She was determined to make sure his methods could never continue. Clara crouched on the bank of the river, adjusting the small pack she had fashioned from scraps of cloth. Inside were the essentials: a few pieces of dried cornbread, a water gourd, a knife taken from the mill, and the letter opener she had used to survive the final confrontation with Devereux. She could feel the weight of it all, heavy with necessity and consequence. The plan she had constructed was simple yet dangerous. She would move under the cover of night, follow the river south until it met the bayou, and use the natural bends and hidden channels to throw off any pursuers. Along the way, she would leave marks and clues, not for others to follow, but to ensure that the truth of Belle Ombre would not be forgotten. Every sound in the swamp was amplified. The splash of a fish, the creak of a tree branch, the distant call of an owl, each one required attention. Clara had learned to move like water, to flow silently, to occupy space without disturbing it. Her body remembered the hours of forced stillness, the punishment corners, the endless repetitions of obedience that Devereux had demanded. Those lessons now served her survival. Hours passed, and the moon rose high, silver and unyielding in the cloudless sky. Clara paused on a small patch of dry land, letting the cool night air wash over her. She thought of the others, those who had endured Devereux's cruelty before her, those who might still be trapped in his system of terror. She could not save them all, but she could carry the memory of their suffering forward, and she could make sure Devereux's name no longer commanded fear. Her journey took her through narrow waterways, over fallen trees, and across shallow marshes. The land was treacherous, filled with hidden pitfalls, and yet every obstacle reinforced her resolve. Clara had learned to endure, to anticipate, to calculate risk. Each decision was deliberate, each movement purposeful. She was no longer the frightened girl from Virginia, she was a survivor, a force shaped by cruelty and hardened by necessity. At dawn, she reached a secluded bend in the bayou, where the water widened and slowed. The reflection of the rising sun painted the surface golden red, a false promise of serenity. Clara stopped, allowing herself a moment to rest, to drink from her gourd, and to look back in the direction of Belle Ombre. The plantation was hidden now, swallowed by distance and the dense swamp, but its shadow lingered in her mind. She felt the weight of what she had endured and the responsibility of what she would do next. Clara knew she could not return. The law would never protect her, and the world she had known was gone. But she also knew that Devereux's legacy had been built on fear, secrecy, and silence. She would not allow that to continue. Using what she had learned from his journals and her observations, she began leaving subtle markers along the banks, twisted reeds, scratches on bark, arrangements of stones. These were not for trackers, but for her own record, a map of the path she had claimed, proof that one girl could defy the darkness. By late afternoon, Clara had reached a settlement along the river. Small, mostly abandoned, it offered a temporary refuge. She moved cautiously through the empty streets, listening for signs of life. A few children played in the distance, their laughter both comforting and bittersweet. Clara understood she was stepping into a world that had no place for her, yet it was freedom in its rawest form, the first breath after a long, suffocating imprisonment. She found a hidden corner in the settlement to rest, huddling against the wall of a crumbling building. Her body ached, her hands were blistered, her stomach grumbled, but her mind was alert, sharp, alive. She reviewed the next stage of her plan, knowing she had to continue south, through towns and plantations, until she reached the fringes of New Orleans, where anonymity could protect her. Night fell again, and with it, a quiet determination. Clara's eyes were sharp in the darkness, her senses attuned to every movement, every sound. She had survived Devereux. She had survived Belle Ombre. And now, in the stillness of the swamp and the hush of the river, she embraced the full measure of her own power. The journey ahead would be perilous, filled with uncertainty and danger, but Clara had learned that fear could be mastered, that pain could be transformed into strategy, and that a single act of courage could reverberate far beyond the boundaries of one life. The shadows of the past could no longer dictate her fate. She was free in the only way that mattered, by claiming control over her destiny, by refusing to be silent, and by stepping boldly into the unknown. And as the Louisiana night closed around her, Clara whispered to herself, a vow carried on the wind: what was taken could never be returned, but justice, her justice, would be made known, one careful step at a time. If you want, I can continue with Part 7, escalating the tension as Clara navigates the swamp, encounters dangers, and moves toward the final confrontation and revelation, keeping it cinematic and perfect for YouTube storytelling. Do you want me to do that next? Here's a fully reworked, gripping Part 7 of your historical horror story, around 1,000 words, easy for American YouTube audiences, with an engaging hook. The swamp does not forgive, but it does reveal. Tonight, Clara's journey into the shadowed heart of Louisiana brings her closer to freedom, and to the truth that will haunt the plantations forever. Part 7. The morning mist clung to the bayou, curling around the cypress knees like ghostly fingers. Clara moved with quiet precision, her eyes scanning the banks for signs of danger. Every ripple of water, every snapping branch could signal a hidden threat. She had learned to trust her instincts, sharpened by months of careful observation and calculated survival. Her journey had carried her far from Belle Ombre, but the horrors she had escaped remained vivid in her mind. The faces of the other girls, the whispers of Aunt Rachel, the cold precision of Devereux's cruelty, they haunted her dreams, but they also fueled her resolve. Clara understood that the swamp itself was both a barrier and an ally. Its twisting waterways, dense foliage, and hidden channels could conceal her from hunters and overseers. She paused at a bend in the river where the water widened into a shallow cove. Here she allowed herself a brief rest, crouching behind a fallen log as the sun broke through the mist. The light caught on her knife, tucked into her belt, and on the letter opener she still carried as a reminder of the survival she had clawed from the jaws of torment. Each tool had a purpose, each movement was deliberate. Clara had learned that freedom demanded more than physical endurance. She needed knowledge, cunning, and patience. She had spent nights memorizing the positions of loose floorboards, hidden doors, and overlooked weaknesses at Belle Ombre. She had studied Devereux's habits, his routines, his small indulgences that revealed his vulnerabilities. All of it prepared her for the moment when she would no longer be running, but acting. The swamp was alive with sound. Frogs croaked, insects hummed, and the distant call of a heron echoed across the water. Clara's senses absorbed everything: the smell of damp earth, the shift in wind direction, the subtle vibrations through the wooden boards she occasionally stepped on. This world, harsh and unforgiving, demanded constant vigilance. And yet, it was here, in this untamed wilderness, that Clara felt the first flicker of control since she had arrived at Belle Ombre. By late afternoon, she had reached a small settlement on the edge of the bayou. Unlike the abandoned buildings she had passed earlier, this village had life, children playing along the water's edge, smoke curling from chimneys, and people moving with the measured rhythm of daily labor. Clara observed them from the shadows, noting the routines and patterns, understanding how she could move unseen. She stayed at the outskirts, using the cover of underbrush to rest and eat. Every bite of dried cornbread, every sip of water, reminded her of what she had endured and what she had at stake. Clara's thoughts returned, inevitably, to Devereux. His cruelty had been methodical, precise, almost scientific. And it had almost destroyed her entirely. But now, months later, she carried that knowledge like a weapon of its own, a cold, steady understanding of human vulnerability and the power of calculated action. As night fell, Clara moved again. She had memorized the layout of the settlement, noting shadows and paths, finding ways to pass unseen. The moon cast a pale light over the bayou, turning the water into molten silver and stretching the shadows of the trees into long, eerie fingers. Each step was deliberate, silent, and careful. She had learned from Devereux that sound could betray intent, that hesitation could be fatal. Hours later, she reached another channel of the bayou that curved deep into the swamp. Here the water slowed and thickened with fallen leaves, and the banks were lined with dense thickets. Clara pushed through silently, her movements fluid, almost ghost-like. The swamp seemed to recognize her as one of its own, offering concealment and protection. She allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She was far from safety, but she was moving on her own terms for the first time in years. Her mind, however, was never idle. She considered the next stage of her plan, the confrontation that would ensure no other girl suffered as she had. She envisioned the scene carefully, the precise moment, the tools, the sequence of events. Clara had learned patience through months of torment, and now that patience was a weapon as potent as any blade. By the time dawn approached, she had reached a natural clearing along the bayou, a narrow strip of land where the water shimmered like glass. Here she paused, crouched low, scanning the horizon. The sounds of the swamp were muted, as if it too held its breath. Clara felt the weight of what lay ahead. She could not return to the world she had left, but she could step forward into a future defined by her own choices. In the quiet, Clara reflected on Aunt Rachel's words, "Finish what you begin, take nothing half-measured." The older woman's warning had been stark, almost prophetic. There was no room for hesitation. No second chances. Clara understood the gravity of her mission. It was not just about survival, it was about justice, about ensuring the horrors of Belle Ombre could not continue. She moved through the swamp with careful precision, each movement rehearsed, each decision deliberate. The rising sun painted the water in hues of gold and crimson, a reminder that even in darkness, light persisted. Clara felt the first glimmer of hope, not the naive hope of escape, but the hard, unyielding hope of control over one's fate. As the day progressed, she encountered the first real test of her journey. A group of men, likely hunters or overseers, moved along the far bank of the bayou. Clara froze, hidden among the reeds, heart pounding, waiting for them to pass. Each second stretched, the tension coiling tight in her chest. The men paused, shouting indistinct commands, then moved on, unaware of her presence. Clara exhaled slowly, relief mingling with renewed determination. She knew the path ahead would be treacherous, filled with dangers both human and natural. But Clara had learned that the swamp rewarded patience, precision, and courage. Each step brought her closer to a destiny she would shape herself, a freedom forged in the fire of her suffering. By evening, Clara found another small settlement, abandoned at twilight except for the faint glow of a fire in the distance. She crept closer, noting the shadows and listening for signs of life. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and earth, the promise of temporary refuge, the whisper of possibilities that lay beyond the swamp. Tonight, she would rest. Tomorrow, she would move again. And every step, every decision, every heartbeat was part of the plan. Clara had become something more than a survivor. She was a force, a reckoning, a testament to what could endure when cruelty had pushed a soul to its limits. And deep in the heart of the swamp, with the bayou twisting endlessly around her, Clara allowed herself a fleeting thought: freedom was close. Justice was closer. And nothing, not even the shadows of Belle Ombre, could stop what was coming next. If you want, I can continue with Part 8, ramping up tension as Clara nears New Orleans, faces new threats, and sets up the final confrontation with the consequences of Devereux's legacy. Do you want me to do that next? Here's a fully rewritten Part 8 of your historical horror story, crafted to engage an American YouTube audience, around 1,000 words, with an engaging hook. She had survived the swamp, but survival was only the beginning. Tonight, Clara steps into the shadows of New Orleans, where freedom and danger dance together, and the ghosts of the past are never far behind. Part 8. The streets of New Orleans were alive in ways Clara had never seen. Horses clattered along the cobblestones, merchants shouted from their stalls, and the scent of spices, smoke, and river water mingled in the thick afternoon air. For a moment, she felt disoriented. The world beyond the swamp was larger, louder, and infinitely more dangerous. But it was also alive, breathing possibilities she had not dared imagine in months. She moved cautiously, blending with the crowds, her small frame and subdued clothing helping her go unnoticed. Every glance from a passerby, every shadowed alleyway, carried potential threat. Clara's mind catalogued everything. The men who lingered too long near doorways, the riverboats docked along the Mississippi, the street children darting between legs and carts. She could not afford a single mistake. Her plan was clear. She needed shelter, information, and allies. The swamp had kept her hidden, but the city demanded strategy. Clara's first stop was a small boarding house on the outskirts of the French Quarter, run by a woman named Madame Lisette, rumored to offer refuge to those in desperate need. The place was tucked down a narrow lane, its windows shuttered, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. Clara approached cautiously, listening for any signs of danger. Inside, the boarding house smelled of herbs, burning candles, and damp wood. Madame Lisette, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and quick hands, greeted her without surprise, as though she had expected Clara. The woman's reputation had spread quietly, a whisper among those who sought freedom, those who ran from cruelty and oppression. "You're far from your home," Madame Lisette said, her voice soft but steady. "And far from safety. Tell me, what brings you here, child?" Clara hesitated, then shared just enough. She spoke of escape, of the dangers she had left behind, and of her need for temporary shelter. She withheld the full weight of her plan, knowing that even here trust was a precious commodity. Madame Lisette studied her, nodding slowly. "You have fire in you," she said. "And a careful mind. You will need both to survive the city. Stay, rest, and do not speak of your business to anyone." "Not yet," Clara agreed, grateful for even this brief reprieve. That night, in the small attic room assigned to her, Clara reflected on her journey. She had escaped the swamp, avoided hunters and overseers, and made her way into a city filled with strangers. But the freedom she sought was not merely physical. She wanted justice, a reckoning for the horrors she had endured, and she understood that the path ahead would require more than courage. Over the following days, Clara observed the rhythms of New Orleans. She watched the riverboats come and go, carrying goods and people, and noted the timing of the patrols that moved through the streets at night. She learned the safe alleys and hidden paths, the markets where she could blend in, and the neighborhoods where danger lurked behind every door. Knowledge was her weapon now, as it had always been. It was during this time that Clara began hearing whispers of others like her, women and girls who had escaped the plantations, hidden in plain sight, forming networks of survival. The stories were fragmentary, shared in hushed tones over meals or in the dark corners of safe houses. She learned of secret meeting points, of sympathetic clergy and free people of color who could provide guidance, and of hidden routes that led to safety along the river. But Clara also learned that the city held dangers far beyond Devereux. Slave catchers operated openly, taking advantage of the chaos and size of New Orleans to capture runaways for profit. Law enforcement was complicit, enforcing laws that considered her property, not her personhood. Every step in the streets, every interaction with strangers, carried the weight of risk. One evening, while observing the riverfront, Clara noticed a trader who bore a resemblance to Rufus Gaines, the man who had once sold her to Devereux. He was speaking with two men, showing ledgers and lists of names. Clara's pulse quickened. Could it be coincidence, or had her flight intersected with the very network that sought to control her? She knew she had to act with extreme caution. Any rash move could lead to recapture, or worse. She spent the next day planning, her mind working through contingencies. She needed to avoid the riverfront during daylight, use the network of safe houses, and gather allies who could help her navigate the city and, eventually, reach beyond. Clara understood that the swamp had only taught her survival. The city demanded strategy, alliance, and deception. Late that night, she ventured out under the cover of darkness. The French Quarter was quieter than during the day, shadows stretching long across narrow streets. Clara moved with measured steps, her eyes sharp, noting every window and doorway. She paused at a small alley, hearing muffled voices. A man and a young woman whispered urgently. Clara waited, blending into the darkness, and caught enough of their conversation to understand. They were planning a journey upriver, to a place beyond the reach of slave traders. Her pulse quickened. This could be her chance, a way to move beyond the city, beyond danger. But she had to be certain, careful. She watched for days, learning their habits, understanding their movements. Trust would be earned, not assumed. During these nights, Clara also reflected on what she had learned from Devereux. The meticulousness, the observation, the patience, and the precision she had endured as a victim could now be wielded as a weapon. Every lesson in pain, every hour of careful surveillance, had become a tool for her own survival and strategy. She understood human behavior, weakness, and opportunity. She would use this knowledge not for cruelty, but for liberation and justice. By the end of the week, Clara had made her decision. She would join this group, traveling upriver to a hidden community where freedom was real, not a dream whispered in the shadows. But she also knew the danger was far from over. Gaines and others like him would not forget the girl who had slipped through their hands. As she prepared to move, she paused on a balcony overlooking the Mississippi, the river flowing wide and dark below. She thought of Belle Ombre, of the faces she had left behind, and of Aunt Rachel's words. She felt the weight of her journey, the cost of survival, and the spark of determination that had carried her from swamp to city. Clara whispered to herself, a promise carried on the wind, I will see justice. I will see freedom, and with the city asleep around her, she stepped into the shadows, ready for the next stage of her journey, where every decision could mean life or death, and where the past and future would collide in ways she could not yet imagine. If you want, I can continue with Part 9, setting up the climactic confrontation and the final reckoning that will bring closure to Clara's story. Do you want me to create Part 9 next? Here's a fully rewritten Part 9 of your historical horror story, crafted for an American YouTube audience, around 1,000 words, with an engaging hook. The night was alive with secrets, and Clara was about to confront the shadows of her past. Every step she took in New Orleans carried the weight of vengeance, survival, and the promise that justice would no longer be whispered in fear. Part 9. The river whispered beneath the moonlight as Clara made her way along the docks, the dark water reflecting the faint glow of gas lamps. The city slept uneasily, its noises dulled to distant echoes. Every footstep was measured, every movement calculated. She had learned in the swamp that carelessness could be fatal, and in the city that lesson was amplified 1,000-fold. Clara's mind revisited every detail of her past. The months of torment at Belle Ombre, the meticulous cruelty of Patience Devereux, the quiet warnings of Aunt Rachel, and the knowledge that she had carried away from the plantation. Each memory sharpened her resolve. The fear that once consumed her had hardened into a cold, unyielding purpose. She would face Devereux again, not as a victim, but as a force no one could ignore. The group she had been observing, the ones planning the upriver journey, had proven trustworthy. They offered guidance, temporary shelter, and information about river routes and hidden safe havens. Clara joined them under the cover of darkness, moving silently through narrow streets, ducking under hanging signs and past closed shop doors. She learned to listen for the quiet rhythm of the city, the subtle cues that signaled danger or opportunity. Days passed, and Clara's preparations took on a new urgency. She studied the ledger of trading contacts she had obtained from overhearing Gaines and his associates. Names, destinations, schedules, all became pieces of a puzzle she intended to exploit. She did not seek revenge in blind fury. She wanted precision, a reckoning that would leave no loose ends. One evening, in a dimly lit room of Madame Lizette's boarding house, Clara laid out her plan to the small group she trusted. Maps, sketches of safe routes, and detailed notes on Devereux's likely reactions filled the table. Every question was considered, every contingency accounted for. Tonight, she said quietly, we move. I have a way to lure Devereux into the river district, and once he's isolated, I can ensure he cannot hurt anyone else. The group nodded, understanding the stakes. Their lives were intertwined with hers now, bound by the shared need for survival and the knowledge that the city could be both refuge and trap. Night fell heavy and humid. Clara slipped from the boarding house, her cloak drawn tight around her small frame. The streets were quiet but never empty. Shadows moved along alleyways, and every sound carried potential threat. Her heart raced, but her mind was focused. She was no longer the girl who had trembled in the corners of Devereux's study. She was a strategist, an observer, and a predator in her own right. The meeting point she had chosen was near an abandoned warehouse along the riverfront, a place where Gaines occasionally kept records and goods before transport. Clara moved silently through the darkened streets, every sense alert, her breath steady. She could see the moonlight glinting off the water, a pale reflection of the determination burning inside her. As she approached, she spotted movement, figures of men unloading crates, one of them unmistakably Gaines. Her pulse quickened, but she maintained calm. Every step, every shadowed corner was a calculated risk. She moved closer, keeping to the darkness, watching their routines, waiting for the moment to strike. Hours passed as she observed, taking note of every habit, every lapse in attention. Gaines was methodical, but complacency showed in the details. Clara had learned this from Devereux. Observation was power, and she wielded it like a weapon. Finally, she saw her opportunity. Gaines stepped away from the group, moving toward a small docked skiff. The moment was precise, measured. Clara slipped forward, drawing the blade she had kept hidden under her cloak, the same blade that had been a symbol of survival months ago. Her hands were steady, her movements deliberate. She had rehearsed this in her mind countless times, each scenario considered and refined. The confrontation was swift. Gaines barely had time to register her presence before Clara seized control, using leverage, surprise, and precision to subdue him. Her actions were cold and efficient. She did not revel in pain, nor in fear. She acted with the singular focus of one who has endured suffering and refuses to let it continue in the hands of others. When the others approached, drawn by the noise, they found Gaines restrained, Clara standing over him with the authority of someone who had claimed control of her fate. There was no celebration, only the quiet acknowledgement that a step had been taken, a measure of justice administered. But even as relief touched her, Clara knew the final reckoning was still ahead. Patience Devereux remained a threat, still alive, still plotting. Her journey through the city, the networks of safe houses, and her careful observation had brought her this far, but she understood that the confrontation with Devereux would be the ultimate test of her resolve. That night, as the river flowed silently beneath the moon, Clara allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had survived the swamp, outmaneuvered Gaines, and gained allies in a city that had once been a maze of danger. The past had been cruel, but it had shaped her into something stronger, something resilient, something unstoppable. In the stillness, she whispered a vow. Devereux will answer for what he has done. No one else will suffer at his hands. Not now, not ever. The words were carried by the river wind, an unspoken promise of justice, a signal that the shadows themselves had been claimed by someone who would not be silenced. And so, Clara prepared. The city slept, unaware that one small figure had begun a reckoning that would reach into the heart of the plantation, into the life of Patience Devereux himself. The next steps would be perilous, but she was ready. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a force. If you want, I can now create part 10, the final part, bringing closure to Clara's story with the ultimate confrontation, resolution, and dramatic ending tailored for a YouTube audience. Do you want me to create part 10 next? Here's a fully rewritten part 10, the final part of your historical horror story, crafted for an American YouTube audience, about 1,000 words, with an engaging hook and a call to action. Hook. The hour of reckoning had arrived. For years, Clara had endured the cruelty of Belle Ombre Plantation. Tonight, the past and present collided, and nothing would ever be the same. Part 10. Final part. The moon hung low over St. Landry Parish, casting pale light across the sugarcane fields. Clara moved with purpose, her shadow slipping between stalks that whispered in the night breeze. The plantation lay quiet, unnaturally so, as if the land itself sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. Clara approached the big house with the knowledge of its every corner. She had memorized floorboards that creaked, windows that unlocked with ease, and passages that led directly to the rooms where Devereux had plotted his years of cruelty. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled. Fear had transformed into resolve, cold and sharp. Inside the study, Patience Devereux sat at his desk, unaware that the past had followed him here. His journal lay open, the meticulous notes about pain and obedience spread across the table. Tonight, they would serve as a record not just of cruelty but of reckoning. Clara stepped through the doorway, her presence finally breaking the illusion of control Devereux had maintained for so long. "Clara," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "I did not expect you to come here." She did not answer. There was no time for words. The months of observation, planning, and endurance condensed into a single, decisive moment. She moved with precision, the blade she had hidden now an extension of her intent. Devereux rose slowly, his composure shaken for the first time. He took a step toward her, then another, but Clara's eyes did not waver. She saw the man as he truly was, imposing to some, but mortal, fallible, and finally vulnerable. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, voice tense now. "I am not here to think," Clara replied. "I am here to finish what you started. You made sure no one could stop you for years, but I am not anyone." The struggle was swift and brutal. Years of survival instincts, every lesson endured under Devereux's hand, guided her movements. He lunged, but Clara anticipated his every move, exploiting the weaknesses she had memorized. The table toppled, papers scattering across the floor, the journal slipping into the shadows. The fight was not about strength but control, precision, and resolve. Clara's small frame belied her capability, honed by months of watching, enduring, and calculating. Devereux faltered, a sharp gasp escaping his lips, his arrogance replaced with panic. Finally, the confrontation ended as quickly as it had begun. Devereux lay subdued, the weight of his years of cruelty pressing upon him in a silence louder than any scream. Clara stood over him, breathing hard but steady, the enormity of the moment settling into her chest. She looked around the room, at the journals that chronicled suffering, at the objects that had been tools of torment. She could destroy them, erase the record, and leave the house behind. But instead, she made a choice that would ensure the story was not forgotten. She gathered the journals, every ledger, every note, and carried them outside to the river. The current accepted them silently, sweeping away evidence but not memory, a quiet witness to the years of injustice and the courage it took to confront it. Clara turned back to the house one last time. The portraits of Devereux's ancestors looked down, but she no longer felt their weight. She had claimed her own narrative, one no ledger could contain, one no cruelty could erase. The river carried her steps forward as she left Belle Ombre behind, the fields bathed in the first faint light of dawn. The city, the swamp, the streets she had navigated, all bore witness to a story of endurance, intelligence, and calculated courage. Clara had survived, but more than that, she had ensured that no one else would fall into the hands of Patience Devereux again. She paused for a moment on the riverbank, looking at the mist rising over the water. The years of fear and isolation, the relentless cruelty she had endured, seemed to settle into something different now, a quiet strength, a hard-earned understanding of power, and the knowledge that even in a world built to oppress her, she could still claim her fate. Her resolve had shaped her into someone new, someone unstoppable, someone who could turn survival into justice. Clara stepped into the shadows of the morning with no backward glance, carrying with her the certainty that evil could be confronted, that the quietest of voices could rise into action, and that one person's courage could change the course of history. The story of Belle Ombre would no longer be whispered only in fear. It would stand as a testament to endurance, ingenuity, and the power of those who refuse to be broken. As Clara disappeared into the rising sun, the plantation remained behind, empty, haunted not by ghosts, but by the reckoning that had finally arrived. The fields, the house, the river, they held the memory of cruelty, but also the memory of courage, a story that would not be buried. If you've followed Clara's journey from the shadows of Belle Ombre to this moment of reckoning, share your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if her courage moved you, subscribe to join us for more stories of hidden history, and share this video with friends who are brave enough to face the truth of the past. Her story proves that even in the darkest corners of history, courage can shine, and justice can find its way.